My name is Maggie Hsu, and I run go-to-market for a crypto fund. I'm joined today by my colleague, Pyrs Carvolth, our go-to-market partner. I'll be talking about what go-to-market is, go-to-market in Web3, some go-to-market tactics, and then Pyrs will deep dive into two critical elements of go-to-market, the role of partnerships and negotiating. So what is go-to-market exactly? Well, go-to-market encompasses many things, but at its core, it's a plan for how to bring a product or service to market, and then it's the execution of that plan. And a go-to-market plan has many elements. First, you're building the product or service offering. You're then defining your target market that you're selling to. You're setting your pricing, determining the appropriate messaging, and then finally, you're deciding where and how to reach your customers. Once the plan is set, how does a company then acquire new customers? Well, you would bring potential customers through this acquisition funnel using a mix of strategies, and it's worth noting that this is an ongoing process. And if all goes well, you're driving usage and growth of the product or service. So what is go-to-market in Web3, and how does that potentially differ from go-to-market in Web2? Well, there are many sorts of Web3 companies that actually have go-to-market plans that are pretty similar to what we just saw. And examples here could be wallets and marketplaces. But there are a number of other types of Web3 companies that have slightly different go-to-market plans. And examples here could be NFT communities or certain types of DAOs. And in these examples, rather than starting by building a product or service offering, they're actually starting by defining the need that they're solving. And rather than defining a target market to sell to, you're starting by defining your target stakeholders. So in these go-to-market plans, you're starting with purpose rather than product. The product can come later. And you're starting by thinking through your stakeholders rather than who you're selling to. And the stakeholders can include your community members, your users, the company itself, or your investors. What determines whether a go-to-market plan is more like the top or the bottom? Well, there are really two factors. The first is the level of decentralization of the company, and this is across three frameworks: technical, economic, and legal. And the second is whether or not they have a token. And whereas in the first example, this is a lot more about top-down planning, in the second example, it's much more about bottom-up gardening, because the approach here is that you're setting strategy and you're creating the infrastructure in a way that doesn't necessarily dictate the outcome, because you oftentimes don't even know what that outcome is at the beginning of the process. Now that you have your go-to-market plan, what are some go-to-market tactics that you could use? This broadly divides into whether you're thinking about things like ecosystems. This could be layer 1 and layer 2 blockchains, or protocols like Uniswap and Compound. Or the second group would be products and services, and these could be wallets, marketplaces, or analytics and monitoring services as some examples. So let's deep dive into ecosystems. Let's say you're launching an L1 or an L2 and you're bringing that to market. Pardon the consulting slide. I'm a former recovering consultant, but we can kind of walk through the supply and demand. So in this case, you're looking to grow both the supply and demand at the same time. And how do you do that? Well, you're targeting both individuals, and so this is a one-to-one motion here, and you're also targeting channels, and this is really one-to-many. And so on the individual side, that's really on the supply side around developers, and on the demand side, it's around your community and your users. Your channels, these are through integrations and partnerships. And then the result here would be number of active developers, active addresses growing, number of transactions, growth in TVL. And I'll just deep dive into each of these categories. So on the first front, developer interest and activity, one critical piece here is developer engagement. Solana runs hacker houses all around the world, and they have engaged tens of thousands of developers for these in-person experiences. Oftentimes, hackathons are done as one-offs, and they've been able to build this scalable program around them to grow and strengthen this developer community. Optimism uses something called retroactive public goods funding, where in this case, they allocate part of their token supply to retroactively reward projects that are bringing value to the Optimism ecosystem. And it's not enough just to have your protocol design or your developer tooling, but in most cases, you really need to develop the first set of front ends as well. So in this case, Farcaster is a social protocol, but they've also developed this front end, Warpcast. This applies to things like payment protocols or L1s, where it isn't enough just to put out the developer documentation, but you really also need to show what's possible. On the second front, community engagement excitement, social connection is so key here, and this comes across both in digital forums, so this is in social media, as well as in physical forums, and this is why events, meetups, and conferences are so important. And there's really this outsized role of community and events, even over marketing, at least at first. Because it's really about building with a community rather than marketing to a community. On the third front, integrations and partnerships. So it's important here to be supported by the likes of custody providers, wallets, and stablecoins. On the partnership side, let's say you're trying to reach many developers at once. One good example could be to partner with a cloud provider. So in this example, Aptos partnered with Google Cloud, or partnering with an IP or brand. So an early example of this was Dapper and Flow partnering with the NBA around Top Shot, or more recently, Polygon partnering with Starbucks around their Odyssey NFT program. And you can also have community-to-community partnerships. So my colleague Scott Commoners has written about a technique called wave minting, where in this case, 1337 Skulls allowed other NFT community holders to mint in waves, starting with the most closely aligned communities, in this case, Nouns and Blipmap. Another example of a community-to-community partnership is when DJ Steve Aoki and Justin Blau created a group called Punks, and they did an NFT giveaway where you had to be a holder of this NFT in order to be eligible for the giveaway. In this case, Blau, Aokiverse, or CryptoPunk. And it may seem like you're trying to do everything all at once, and instead of tracking one growth metric, you're really tracking several different metrics. But these are truly complex adaptive systems. And examples of these sorts of systems include ant and bee colonies, cities, your immune system, financial markets. In these systems, you have heterogeneous agents. They're coming together to interact, and then there's some sort of emergence that happens. And it's impossible to deterministically plan the outcome of your efforts. The best you can do here is really to equip the various agents within your ecosystem to move forward towards a shared vision. I'll now just touch on products and services. So again, examples here could be a wallet or a game. And here, the user acquisition model is very similar to in Web 2, where you're attracting, engaging, and converting potential users. You have a number of traditional growth levers, such as advertising and sponsorship, but you also have things like token incentives, and we're just starting to see how these all tie together. One example is Coinbase. Coinbase has done things like traditional TV ads, they've done sponsorships, but they also did this open edition mint when they launched Base, their L2. And another example is Nike's .swoosh, where they've used things like out-of-home advertising, but they've also used tactics such as Airdrops and token-gated early access. So now I'll pass it to my colleague Pyrs to deep dive into partnerships.
It's nice to see everybody. It's not often that I'm up on the stage in front of you. Usually we're like tucked away in a conference room somewhere. But happy to have this opportunity to dive deeper into partnerships and negotiations. And why are we spending time double-clicking on partnerships? Well, they not only can help you make better products, they can help you reach a new audience, and they can help you drive revenue. And when done correctly, the ever-important rocket ship, it can turn into a growth strategy in and of itself. So it's a big, bold statement. Partnerships can drive growth. What does that mean? Well, you think about Uber and Spotify. They entered into a partnership to allow users to personalize the music in their ride. Really cool partnership on the surface, very calculated by Uber. At a time of hyper competition, they wanted to make their product stand out. They wanted to attract their market share. And a partnership with Spotify was a way to do that. Low key, they also were driving more app usage while their riders were in the ride, and thus potentially able to monetize ad revenue while you're in app. You think about reaching a new audience, Lego and Netflix. They just recently partnered in 2019 to bring a Lego set to market called The Upside Down, the most iconic scene from Stranger Things. So Stranger Things has been streamed over like 1 billion hours or some ridiculous metric. And a third of that audience is of the age 18 to 29. So for Lego, it's a really authentic way to start engaging with their audience that's maturing out of childhood and into what they call adults welcome category. And then, of course, couldn't talk about partnerships without talking about Taco Bell and Frito-Lay. For over a decade, the Dorito Locos Taco has existed. And when they first launched this partnership in 2012, Taco Bell literally had to hire 15,000 people just to keep up with the demand. In the first year of its existence, they did over $1 billion in sales. So partnerships are not just a way to help you make better products, reach new audiences, or drive revenue. They're a way to think about growth overall. Plus, they're really, really fun, I promise you. They're fun to think about, they're fun to negotiate, and they're fun to execute. So today, we hope to give you a framework that helps you think pragmatically about partnerships and gives you some tools for negotiating those partnerships. We hear resoundingly from founders, it's really hard to know where to start, or even how to start. So what we're gonna try to do here is mechanize your partnership strategy and help you turn it into a growth strategy so that you can attract, engage, and convert new users. We'll talk about rooting in your growth objectives. We'll move on to thinking about a framework that you can prioritize with, and then we'll talk about everyone's least favorite topic, the dreaded cold outreach. So to root everybody in an idea of what we mean by thinking about your growth objectives, I'm going to talk a little bit about my time at DraftKings. If you're unfamiliar with DraftKings, it's one of the largest digital sports, entertainment, and gaming companies in the world. They have real money products, in other words, gambling products, like fantasy, sports betting, and casino games. And I joined to help them convert on a fairly simple but very calculated thesis. And that thesis was that there were millions of active monthly users already using DraftKings' existing products. They had a DraftKings digital wallet that had positive cash balances, and they showed a propensity or behavior similar to that of what we understood to be the NFT collector at the time. So the thesis was that by launching a Web3 product, we could increase engagement and spend with existing products, decrease churn and add new users, and then cross-sell between the products. So what does that do? Well, let's root it back to our growth metrics. That helps us lower customer acquisition cost, or CAC, helps us increase the long-term value of those customers, and helps us grow the addressable market, or the TAM. And so we built and launched the DraftKings NFT Marketplace and Rainmakers, which is an NFT gamified platform. And so where does partnerships come into play? Well, in launching those products, we thought deeply about the types of partnerships that would support the product launches. So we partnered with world-class Web3 companies like Autograph to bring a better product in the form of digital collectibles rooted in their legendary roster of athletes originally, like Tom Brady. Then we also tapped into Web3 native communities like Moonbirds and Deadfellas to reach new audiences that maybe weren't even on DraftKings yet, but had been collecting in the space. And then finally, we partnered with global IP holders like the NFL Players Association, the UFC, the PGA Tour, to thoughtfully scale the drops in our revenue potential over time. So, working example from start to finish. You guys got it? Right. It's not as simple as it sounds. We have to talk about foundational frameworks and building blocks. And so I'm going to go back to what Maggie very eloquently described, which is a need, purpose, and stakeholder framework that's really, really authentic to Web3. Or in Web2 terms, you could just think about consumers and products. So this is a process that should be deeply introspective as a founder, but it doesn't have to be complex. In fact, it should be really, really simple so that you can articulate it. If you're having trouble articulating what you're doing and who you're doing it for, this might be an opportunity to course correct. So let's take an example, IRL. EIP 4337. If you're building to address that EIP, maybe you're building with account abstraction, smart contract wallets, the middle need or purpose should not simply just say account abstraction or smart contract wallet. It has to say things that are deeper, like single sign-on. It has to say key management and recovery, advanced and gasless transactions, automated transactions. Dig deeper into the need and purpose. By being more deliberate with what the need and purpose is, you're also able to open the aperture of who your stakeholders are. So with our EIP 4337 example, we're not just talking about, this one nebulous thing applies to this one cohort. We're talking about these very specific solutions applied to this much broader set of stakeholders. So in our example, this shouldn't say just wallets. It should say individual wallet providers, wallet aggregators, browser extensions, dApps, Web3 games, Web2 platforms. By opening the aperture of your stakeholders, you also then can start to make more stakeholder purpose pairs, which result in more partnership opportunities. Okay, so like pie in the sky, you have all these partnership opportunities. How the heck are you going to prioritize your resources, your time, your money, your energy? Well, what we encourage you to do is develop this framework or a scorecard to be able to score those partnerships. And this is filled in with just some placeholders. This is going to completely vary based on what you're building, the stage of your development, and potentially your philosophical values and ideals. But you want to think of this as almost a weighted average or some sort of blended average where you're going to output a score based on a potential partner to be able to compare them somewhat apples to apple. The goal is for a consistent rubric to be able to measure and compare over time. It can totally change and be flexible, but by outputting a score, you're able to compare partners on a level playing field. So what do you do with the scores? Well, hopefully, you can do this mentally, or if you're a paper person like I am, you actually get out a little sheet of paper and start drawing logos on a slide. But the y-axis of this is the score, right? How valuable is the potential partnership to your business? And the x-axis is how practical is it? Do you have the resources, the time, money, and energy to execute on this partnership? And is your partner potentially aligned? How hard is it going to be to sell that into them? Do you have a shared and mutual understanding of the partnership objectives? Practical is subjective, but it should root you in this idea of what is realistic. So let's take a layer one ecosystem. There are innumerable number of partnerships that you could think to satisfy stakeholder and purpose pairs. And some of them would satisfy multiple. At a minimum, you want to spend your time in the top right quadrant, right? Where things are super valuable and super practical. But it's also okay to have stretch goals. It's okay to be in the top left quadrant, where things are super valuable to you, but they might take longer. They might require more education. Hopefully an exercise like this might show you, though, if you are not an EVM-compatible layer one, it's unrealistic and potentially not very beneficial to try to convert an EVM-compatible PFP into your network. There's a lot of different examples we can dig into with this, but hopefully the demonstration shows that you need a mental framework to be able to prioritize your time and resources. Similarly, in the landscape of IP licensing, traditionally, IP licensing is a high-margin business. The holders of those IP will not do anything that dilutes their margin. So it's really hard to negotiate these deals. It's really hard to identify the right partners. A 100-year-old media company might be super high value to you, but because it's 100 years old and well-established and has valuable IP, it's going to be hard to work with them. They're going to have rules about where their IP can be distributed and how it's protected and all the things that go into that, like takedown clauses and everything. So, conversely to that, you might think about a CC0 PFP. It's not very hard to integrate. It's CC0. By nature of the Creative Commons, you can use the IP in your integration. Does that mean it's valuable, though? It might not be, because it can be anywhere, because it's CC0. So this is, again, a framework just to keep you rooted in what is truly valuable to pursue as a partnership and what is realistic to convert on across the landscape of opportunities. Ostensibly, you've identified your top targets. Now it's time for everyone's least favorite activity, trying to find the right people to reach out to and writing to them. We used to say hitting the phones, but I feel like now we just have to talk about hitting the keys. So there are things that are native to Web3, Discord, crypto Twitter, etc. I don't want to undervalue the LinkedIn as a platform. As our industry is maturing, more people are starting to represent their professional identities in Web3 on LinkedIn. It's a very powerful tool for for being able to identify the right persona in terms of titles, in terms of posts that they're actively posting about, and in terms of connections that they may have. Because at the end, we're all working in networks, and connections are nodes, and you should definitely leverage them to your advantage. So when you find the right person, it's time to raise the flag. Make them realize that they have a problem. Not like a literal problem, but like they have a need, and the need that you're building for. And then give them an easy path to yes. The worst cold outreach ends with no question and no next step. It could literally be anything. You could ask them to go for a walk. You could ask them for a coffee. You could ask them if their favorite basketball team is the Warriors. Ideally, it would be related to the type of partnership that you want to broker and your product, but do not let a cold email go cold. It needs to warm up. So you have to give your recipient a reason to respond. Make it easy. Assuming you've made it easy and you get to the negotiating table, what are you doing? Negotiating is a topic and exercise that many people find uncomfortable or purely just unapproachable. It's often classified or depicted as this super aggressive, intense conversation where there's a winner and a loser. And it certainly does not have to be that way. There's no shortage of research or literature on the topic of negotiation. And so I'm going to show some books that are like my personal favorite books, but it's by no means, an endorsement. Frankly, they might not be the right books for you, but I encourage you to explore the research and literature that's out there. This is a long process, developing a style. It's like developing a fashion style. Like it changes over time, it evolves with you and matures. But we're going to talk about two basic principles that I've found really helpful, and hopefully you will too. So this is probably not what you thought we were going to start talking about with respect to negotiating. But, and this is going to date me, in 1998, Jerry Seinfeld released his stand-up, I'm Telling You for the Last Time, on DVD. Remember those? And I can remember being a small kid, I think I was like 7 at the time, and we would watch this DVD over and over and over as a family. And I'm not going to do the bit because it would be terrible, but Jerry has this bit, it's called Kids Up, Parents Down. And it's this concept that when you're a child, everything is up, right? Everything in your world is up. It's wait up, shut up, hold up, let me stay up. And it really resonated with me. Like I pictured somebody like literally flicking a cord in my soul when I was 8, and it has stuck with me ever since. Because kids are literally the best negotiators. And why? Well, this is my allowance book from a similar time frame, 96, 97. And in 96, I was getting $6 a month as my allowance. And then something remarkable started happening. I started asking for bonuses. Anybody who knows me, this isn't like a far-fetched concept that I want more. But, I would realize my dad would bring all of our siblings around to the kitchen table. We'd sit down with our allowance books, and I would be there, and he'd be doling out cash, and I got the least amount of cash. And something didn't sit right with me. Like, why should I get less money for being 4 years younger? So I started asking for more money. And that's because I have nothing to lose as a child, literally nothing to lose. The worst that could happen to me is like I just keep making $6. So over time, this habitual and persistent ask for $4 extra converted about 9 months later into full-time $10 a month. So I just asked, and that's a concept that's also stuck with me. When you're in a negotiation and you're not sure if something's on the table, just ask. Another interesting facet about kids in negotiating is they have no context for losing, literally no historical context for losing. This is a picture of a project that I did when I was going to kindergarten. And there's a nice little picture of me and some lovely verbiage about me being nervous and all this stuff. And then the answer to what I wanted to learn to do better at that year was jumping 40 feet high. Like, how unrealistic and just like childish and innocent and sweet is that? But it's a really interesting concept. I don't have any context for 40 feet being impossible. In my mind, it's possible. So what I take away from this is children are the best negotiators because they have nothing to lose and they have no context for losing. And now we all know that temper tantrums and crying aren't going to get you very far in a business negotiation. But having those two principles of understanding will make you a very, very strong and compelling negotiator. Now, doing a little bit of homework and reading and evolving your idea and your style of negotiating will help you find the right balance. So you can think of negotiating as this spectrum of zero-sum versus win-win. And of course, some negotiations are zero-sum. There will be a winner and there will be a loser. And there's a fabulous book called Never Split the Difference, and that will help educate you on to negotiate tactically through zero-sum outcomes. There's also a book called Getting to Yes. Getting to Yes talks about inventing mutual beneficial outcomes. Maybe they don't exist when you enter into the negotiation, but you can find them if you try. And that's stylistically where I fall. So sometimes it's true that it's zero-sum, and you can recognize and be good in those situations, but you can also control the conversation and make it mutually beneficial for both parties. The way that you can start to think about doing that is not by having strict rules. Rules are too prohibitive. They don't allow you the flexibility to respond and adapt to your environment. Instead, start to think about principles. Like ideologically, how do you enter into a relationship and how do you navigate negotiating? I don't care if it's a professional setting or a personal setting, you have to be interested to be interesting. If you're not interested in what the other person is saying, what are you even doing in that relationship? And that comes forward in negotiating. You have to be an active listener. You have to kind of set aside your objectives. It's okay to recall, like as you enter into a negotiation, these are the outcomes I want, but you have to set them aside and actively listen to your counterparty to be able to hear where they are in terms of the negotiation and how you start to find the middle ground. You also need to use something called tactical empathy. And this is talked about in Never Split the Difference, and I use this with my wife a lot. You have to put yourself in the position of your counterparty and draw them into your position. It starts with a lot of questions of like, what would you do if? Or how should I respond? And what this does, there's a lot of science behind this, but it actually neutralizes their brain. Like they spend so much time thinking about how to empathize with you that it brings down their intellectual ability to negotiate a hard deal. So I'd spend some time thinking about what tactical grade empathy looks like for you. And then finally, the feature benefit ladder. This is an oversimplified explanation of what this is, but through a conversation, you always want to be leading your counterparty to yes and to understanding why it's valuable to say yes. So this goes along the lines of the book Getting to Yes and creating mutual beneficial outcomes. If you can invent mutually beneficial outcomes and convince the counterparty that what you've invented is the best outcome possible, then you drastically increase your chances of arriving at an agreement and having a very, very solid, good working relationship with your potential partner. Any questions?
Hi, Murat from PrimeEv. Can you talk a little bit more about the tactical empathy aspect of it? I think, I can imagine some scenarios where the person just replies like, "Oh, you should do this," which is like what they want you to do.
Yeah.
But how do we kind of penetrate that like initial barrier so that they actually like consider seeing it from your perspective? Maybe some best practices or tips around that.
So it can depend on the situation, but I would encourage you to think about two things. The right type of leading question to ask, and you can kind of like develop a war chest of these. I ask a lot, like, how am I supposed to go back to my executives with that? And just posing that question and then leaving a pause for them to answer. You can ask, if you were in my position, how would you respond to that? And it kind of makes your counterparty contemplate a different scenario, which is not the outcome that they're driving towards, but the outcome that you have to accept. And so I would encourage you to just think about what are the right leading questions to help my counterparty see things from my point of view. Ultimately, you need to do the same actively to arrive at a mutually beneficial outcome. But having those questions like bankrolled in your mind is always a really helpful tactic.
That's good, thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, both. Thanks for the talk, insightful as always. I have a question on go-to-market for Maggie specifically. And it's a little bit specific, but it's really around strategies for Airdrop and how do you think about Airdrop as a go-to-market strategy, right? So how do you think about leveraging airdropping as a strategy for growth? And what do you think are the pros and cons of airdrops?
It's a great question. I think I would think about active versus passive. So in an airdrop, you're actively, the user's passively receiving something, right? And so unlike maybe an open edition mint where they're going to mint and they're actively taking an action, and so do you want them to basically be taking the action beforehand and then getting something passively, or is the action itself meant to be kind of that primer mechanism? And I think there are pros and cons to each. I'd say the one downside to an airdrop is they have it, and then there might not be incentives to continue engaging because it was something they did, and then they now receive that, versus something that's a little bit more active. But I would, nothing is perfect, and I would think about using airdrops in conjunction with other tools because each tactic that I discussed has its different pros and cons.
Thanks, appreciate that.
How do you think about design partnerships, specifically working with companies and getting them to buy into a product or service that maybe doesn't exist yet?
I'd say design partnerships are critical, and so when you're just starting out, having 3 to 5 key design partners can really help inform that longer-term roadmap. And I would want to have them in a variety of different areas. So if you had 3 or 4 different use case focuses, having 1 to 2 in each of those categories. But at the same time, I wouldn't get too bogged down in them. And so sometimes a feature that a design partner wants might not be something that you end up building or developing, and understanding when and when not to prioritize their feature requests. That's kind of the art.
Yeah, I think the only addition to that would be as you think through those partnerships and they evolve in their level of maturity and potentially reach the stage of a contractual negotiation, making sure that you maintain strict control of your product roadmap, to Maggie's point, is always critical. Design partners are 100% necessary and beneficial, but you need to be able to have the flexibility and adaptability to control your own product roadmap.
Got it. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for all the great advice. I had a question around approaching pricing when we're kind of moving people over from trial period. They like the product, they're interested so far, but is there anything before we kind of drop the pricing question on them, anything we should do leading up to that? And then my other question would be when we're approaching somebody new and they ask about pricing right away, like how do we answer that when we haven't fully assessed the client yet? I guess maybe the first question is is there anything we should do leading up to dropping the pricing and we're transitioning you into a price tier? Any way to make that most successful and make them excited about it?
I think one element would be articulating the features and benefit, and so not underpricing just because you're new, but really showing them the value of what the pricing gives them. If you have comparables, that's always helpful if they're doing something today that you can map to. But if not, then it's the sign of white space. And we have kind of that pricing framework that Jason and I wrote about, where there are a few different types of pricing models you could consider.
I think the only additional thing is to consider maybe is the upsell opportunity that you're developing as your product develops. And so never being underprepared is always a good tactic. So having an answer prepared, whether you want to point to specific pricing or not, or use your feature benefit ladder as a way to upsell them into a pricing tier is an optimal outcome for if you're not quite sure yet.
Right. Maybe just one follow-up. If they're, say, working with somebody that's taking care of some portion of the same feature set we're providing, is there a tactical way to find out how much they're currently paying for that?
I'd say in some cases you could even just ask them,
Yeah.
and they might want to tell you, right? Because there's benefit there. But there are other ways to figure it out from different market reports or from just understanding the market.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the advice.
Thank you for the talk. I had a question concerning specifically for negotiating L2 partnerships in terms of picking out a specific partner. Do you have any tips for navigating that arena?
I mean, I think so. There's a number of different frameworks that you can use to potentially approach this. From a technical perspective or from a financial perspective, they all kind of materialize into a ranking system, right? You have to develop a model in your own mind of how you're going to value the benefit or the costs of selecting a specific partner. So traditionally, that could come down to very technical metrics like, transactions per second or scalability, like the canonical trilemma. From a financial perspective, it could come down to, how rich is the deal? How approachable is it? and then using those frameworks to make calculated bets. In the end, when you're thinking about deep partnerships, like selecting a layer 2, like you need to be thoughtful and understand that it is a big step and a big partnership.
The only thing I would add is this is obviously still evolving, so I would think about the partnership over time and making sure that if it's layer 2 that you select and they continue to grow and become potentially the dominant one, how does that partnership play out? On the flip side, if they become less prevalent, how does that partnership play out? And so just mapping that and what that looks like.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that, Pyrs and Maggie. That was fantastic.